Good afternoon and welcome to the Equity is Justice panel on Pell and Universal Eligibility. My name is Dr. Bria Willingham and I am an associate professor of criminal justice at SUNY Plattsburgh and co-founder of the Jami Sisterhood, and I will be your moderator for today. So welcome. Today we will challenge the epistemological root and of colonization and white supremacy in education. We will be demanding access to education for all people. Opening, we would like to introduce Congressman Danny Davis. Congressman Danny Davis is a senior member of the U.S. House of Representatives who has served the 7th Congressional District of Illinois, including much of Chicago, since 1996. Congressman Davis is a member of the powerful House Ways and Means Committee and chairs the Worker and Family Support Subcommittee. Over the past 3 years, Congressman Davis has been the lead sponsor of the REAL Act in the House of Representatives. The legislation would fully repeal the prohibition of Pell Grant eligibility for all incarcerated people. Congressman Davis is a key partner in the fight to restore Pell Grants for all incarcerated people and a tireless advocate for improving the lives of people transitioning from the criminal legal system into the community.
This is Congressman Danny Davis, and in this era of high-tech communication, this era where you need to have skills and be conversant with all of those things that are available, every individual must have and is in need of the opportunity to learn as much as they can. That's why I introduced the REAL Act, so that individuals incarcerated, individuals who have been convicted of a crime, would have opportunity when they return to civilian life to have the skills needed to enter the workforce. And that's why the REAL Act is so important.
Thank you, Congressman Davis. Equity is Justice is a campaign to expand access to education inside places of confinement and other spaces on the margin. Many of the fiercest advocates for abolitionist change-making say that education played a critical role in their intellectual liberation and pathways to leadership. Equity is Justice is also a collaboration of people and organizations that share a mission to center the voices of those directly impacted. Some of the organizations and people currently include CCF, formerly Incarcerated College Graduates Network, Drug Policy Alliance, the Vera Institute, Michelle Daniel Jones, Dr. Aaron Corbett, and Second Chance Educational Alliance Incorporated, and many others who are formerly incarcerated in organizations led by those formerly incarcerated who seek to uplift all of those who have touched the criminal legal system in some way. So you can follow along at CCF on Twitter to stay posted on all of the upcoming events for Equity is Justice. And you can also follow the hashtag Equity is Justice. There will be a Q&A period at the end of this panel discussion. So please drop your questions below or use the hashtag Equity is Justice. And the team will pull all the questions together, and then we will answer as many questions as we can during the Q&A period. So I will now turn to the panelists to introduce themselves.
Hello, my name is George Chochos, and I'm the Senior Federal Policy Associate at Vera Institute of Justice. Significantly, I went to prison in New York from 2000 to 2011 for a 14-year sentence. And I was very fortunate to get sent to Eastern Correctional Facility, where I was accepted into the BARD Prison Initiative, earned an AA and BA through BARD College, And after I was released from prison in 2011, I was the first person with a felony record to get into Yale University School of Divinity, earned 2 master's degrees, and I'm also a PhD student at Georgetown University studying theology.
Thank you, George. No sound, Dr. Corbett.
You would think I would be used to unmuting myself with all of the webinars. Hi, I'm Dr. Erin Corbett. I am the co-founder and CEO of Second Chance Educational Alliance Incorporated, along with Dr. Bria Willingham. I am co-founder and executive team member of the Jami Sisterhood. The Second Chance Educational Alliance is a college program that operates out of Connecticut, providing a pathway to a bachelor's degree in business administration for incarcerated men in the state of Connecticut in partnership with Southern New Hampshire University. I also do consulting for philanthropic organizations and work with Michelle Daniel Jones on a couple of projects around higher ed and prison at the state level as well.
Thank you. Next up, we have Renell.
Yeah, we use that and a sanitizer tablets I can provide you. Hello, how you doing? I'm sorry, you guys. My name is Renell Duma. I'm actually in the middle of a health department inspection. Perfect timing. I am the COO of Juice King's Juice Bar and a returning citizen. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you. And next we have Michelle.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michelle Daniel Jones. I'm a fourth year doctoral student at New York University. I am the CEO and co-founder of board president of Constructing Our Future in Indianapolis, Indiana. It is a reentry alternative and housing, transitional housing program for formerly incarcerated women in the state. As you've heard, I work with Erin and I work with the Ed Trust, and I do a lot of advocacy around higher education in prison, and my wheelhouse, eliminating collateral consequences of criminal convictions for formerly incarcerated people. Happy to be here.
Thank you, Michelle. And that's everybody, right? Okay, so we will jump into the questions now. So the first question, our first category of questions have to do with the issue of privilege advocacy. And the first question goes to you, Michelle. So in the last panel, Terrell Blunt, head of the formerly incarcerated college graduates network, said that people who push for education for anything less than all come from a place of privilege. Could you explain on this?
Yeah, Terrell said something very powerful in that panel discussion. He said justice is not up for negotiation because we view access to education as a right for everyone, and not just for those who are not impacted by the criminal legal system. So advocacy on this issue is not about begging. It is about demanding justice and demanding what is right. And so we all need to decolonize our minds on this issue, where we're thinking that we need to beg for this access. And we need to push for education. In order to push for this in order to push for education in this area, we need to orient ourselves around the idea that it is a right. And then everyone else who is behind those people who are on the front lines advocating for them, need to actually stand and support them with their dollars, with their advocacy, with their social media support, so that when we go before the legislators, they understand that we're moving as a group of people and we're moving as a force, as opposed to individual institutions trying to advocate alone. And that's how we get it done. And so this issue of privilege means the orientation is like, same way in the civil rights movement, oh, we can't fight for everything. We need to be very incremental and we need to beg. This idea, Terrell is blowing up. He's saying justice is not a negotiation. We need to just do what is right. And fair, equal access to higher education, even to those incarcerated, is right.
Yes.
That's what he meant.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. George, I have a question for you. So, in what ways do policy reforms that fail to benefit all impacted people undermine the broader criminal legal reform efforts?
Sure. Thank you for that question. So, as I mentioned in my introduction, I study theology, so I come at a lot of these policies from a theological lens. I'm not going to delve too far into that, but there are a lot of correlates that I see with how to think of this in a particular type of way. For example, when people go to prison, it seems that the criminal legal system is the only system that takes particular types of categories and pronouncements and makes them constitutive in nature, and meaning that saying something like "you are human" is also like analogous to saying "you are a criminal" or "you are an offender," "you are an inmate." These labels become constitutive in nature and seem to define the total of someone's humanity. And so when we're talking about the criminal legal system, we already, in some sense, are kind of conceding a ground that people in prison are somehow less than human, that you're already in a dehumanized status. And so there's things we can do to, say, inmates, criminals, offenders that we wouldn't do to husbands, fathers, sons, daughters, wives. And so because there's already this concession to that, that when we start talking about policies and practices and reforms, there seems to be in the public imagination, the public consciousness, this pushback, right? Like these people, but you're not really saying these people. You're really saying these inmates, right? Because what we would do for people if we were to take away the ascribed statuses and just say, do we want people to flourish? Do we want people to have access to quality education? Do we want people to have full access to citizenship and to the rights that everyone else enjoys? Yeah. And I think that initially, without all the baggage and without the valences of the ways in which we talk about inmates and people inside of the prison system, the natural inclination is to say yes. But the minute we begin to add particular labels, and especially if we say violent offender, especially if we say someone on life without parole, that if we were to remove those particular types of labels, then the particular types of rights and the educational opportunities seem to be a no-brainer. And so if we want to have real policy reform, we need to take a step back and realize that regardless of what the pronouncement inside of a court of law says, people in prison are still human. They have inherent dignity and value, and that we would want the range of opportunities for them that we would want for us, we would want for our families. And it's not that we're giving somebody an undeserved benefit. It's something that we want in order for humans to flourish inside of our society.
Yes. Oh, thank you. That was powerful. Michelle, I'm gonna kick it back to you. Do arguments such as that life sentence is defined differently across states help or hurt our cause?
Because in this tough on crime era, people can make the issue that people serving a life sentence don't need access to higher education because they're on a path to die. And to die in prison, so they don't need education as a link to coming outside, and that's a fundamental error for those who, in years past, have fought to connect education with reducing recidivism. In actuality, access to a higher education is about someone's quality of life wherever they are.
Yes.
In the outside world, yes, it might be about your career mobility and your access to greater financial wealth. While incarcerated, it has the same or similar power. For example, in the facility I was incarcerated in, women who had access to a higher education, associates and bachelors, were often chosen for leadership positions within the facility. Those women were able to be interviewed to be clerks, to be PAs, to be law clerks, to be people who got in positions of power to actually benefit the community. So it's about quality of life wherever you are.
Mhm.
And so arguments such as that people in prison who are serving life sentences do not need a higher education, is patently false. And again, it does the same work that George is talking about. It dehumanizes the person and removes their personhood, so that you can simply say that thing sitting in that cell should not have the right and access to an education, because that thing is going to remain there for the rest of their lives.
Yes.
And we're talking about people.
Yes.
And that's the fundamental difference there.
Yes. Great. Thank you both for that. And we're going to move along to our next category. We're going to be talking about underlying assumptions on the limited value of education. And I'll start with you, Dr. Corbett, because I don't think we have Renell right now. So Dr. Corbett, could you tell us what is the problem with assuming education is only tied to employment, and also is receiving education a right?
Thanks for that question, Dr. Willingham. Education is absolutely a human right, and the extent to which someone with a long sentence, a life sentence, life without parole, sentenced to death, the extent to which that they can benefit from access to higher education is really on par with what Michelle was just saying, that this is about quality of life. There are also theoretical aspects and assumptions about education being used to help us socialize. And so how we develop our social capital networks is tied intrinsically to how we have been educated, who has educated us, and who around us share similar levels of education or even higher levels of education that they choose to share with us. We know that a lot of times when programs are not offered in some of the higher security facilities for folks with longer sentences, there's a lot of peer-to-peer instruction. There's a lot of sharing of information and knowledge that happens because people yearn universally to learn about themselves, to learn about others, to learn about society, the society in which they live, the society in which they are confined. And so access to education, to increase literacy, to all of these pieces is all part of how we put ourselves together as human beings and United States citizens. It also underscores the fact that there are many people who think that once you are in prison, that you just stop everything. And I want to go back to what Michelle was saying and a little bit of what George was saying. There are jobs inside facilities. There are groups and opportunities for socialization inside the facilities. And so we should not be removing these additional resources for people to better themselves inside.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's move into educational pedagogy. And George, I'm going to come back to you now. As someone who was the first formerly incarcerated person to get into Yale Divinity School, what was that experience like? And did you feel alone? Was there any pressure to act in a particular way? What can you tell us?
Yeah, that is a deep question. I don't want to take too long. As a preacher, also, we can be very long-winded, so just tell me to stop.
Okay, so
yeah, and so I went to prison in 2000. I got out in 2011. And if you just think of what life was like, and I went at the beginning of 2000, if you think of what life was like in 1999 and what life was like in 2011, and imagine the Rip Van Winkle effect if somebody had fallen asleep from those years. Imagine if that person had never used the internet before, didn't know how to really use cell phones, didn't know how to navigate society. And then you're thrown into this strange new world and expecting to flourish. And society is moving very fast and you're moving very slow. And you can't slow it down, you can't speed yourself up. And living within that tension, the physical transition from prison to society takes a second. The psychological transition from prison to society takes a lifetime. And everything about prison, from the clothes you wear to the food that you eat to just everything about it is a total institution, which means it boxes you into a particular way to where you have no reprieve from it. And so the way that you learn to survive inside of prison is exactly antithetical to what it means to thrive in society, to have authentic relationships. I'll just stop there. So when I got out, there was only two things I knew how to do. If you just think about it, experientially, the only way I knew how to be in society was before I went to prison, and that wasn't an option anymore. But I also acquired this education while I was in prison. I developed different types of ways of thinking and being and relating to people. And so when I got to Yale, the interesting thing when I got out, I was able to go back into a lot of the jails I was in and to go back and to speak and to share my experience, strength, and hope, and even some of my own shortcomings and stumbling along the way as I got out, because it was more difficult than I let on probably. And so the two places I felt most comfortable when I got out of prison was in a college classroom at Yale and inside of a prison.
Wow.
It was the two places where I felt like I could breathe.
Wow.
Where I felt like me. Even to this day, 9 years out, when I go back into a prison, I still feel like I can breathe again.
Wow.
Or when I'm sitting in a college classroom, and maybe that's why I'm a glutton for punishment and almost at 52 and a PhD, but also because I feel like I feel like a midget sitting on the shoulders of giants on everybody that came before me. Because I left prison with people way smarter than me, greater drive and determination. They just didn't have access to the opportunities I had. So to get to the full answer of this question is, I thrived in a particular way at Yale because I knew how to be a student, and I used my student role from prison on how to interact with people at Yale. Outside of that, how to navigate everything else took a lot of time. But I will say that Yale Divinity School, and I'm quite sure that they were probably saying, here's a guy with great academic, well, not that great, with good academic credentials. But also this 11-page rap sheet. And how do we weigh and I'm sure that they had to say, well, how do we weigh the quote unquote safety of this school with our need to want to help? And because it's Divinity School, significantly, Michelle Alexander had just given a lecture at Yale Divinity School right before as they were getting ready. The whole school had actually started to do this something called the all school read, where the school bought a book for every student. And so the whole school was reading her book, and here comes my application. And so there were a number of people that were supportive. I mean, it was a very supportive institution. The community was somewhat supportive, but it was a difficult transition. But again, because I knew how to be a student in prison, it helped me to flourish in that space. And I think that higher ed institutions, not just on the inside, but on the outside, can play a major role, especially for those of us coming back that had the honor and privilege of getting our education in prison.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for that answer. And I just wanted to take a moment to remind all of our viewers to drop all of your questions and comments in the question box, okay? Because we would love to have a conversation with you after we are done with our panelists. So I'm going to move to Dr. Corbett now. Dr. Corbett, can you explain the term gentleman scholar? How does the notion of gentleman scholar undermine education?
Thanks for that. So gentleman scholar is a term that I actually became new to as a result of an article that was written by Dr. D.L. Stewart out of Colorado State University, an article that he wrote that talks about the intransigence of inequality. And what it talks about and what the term itself sort of means is that, as we know that higher education was not built or meant or intended for low-income people and people of color, it pushes us beyond sort of that tipping point and forces us to recognize that embedded in higher ed not being built for us and built specifically to exclude us, there is an expectation that the overwhelming white males at the time when higher ed sort of first became burgeoning, they were being trained to be gentlemen scholars. And so that theme has stayed with higher education for the duration. There are still schools, there are institutions, programs, degree programs, professors that are pushing this gentleman scholar idea without understanding that the demographics of college students have changed, that history is always in flux, and that we're really living in a dynamic society that can no longer and should no longer sustain such a white supremacist, patriarchal, instructional kind of ideological structure. And so when we have higher ed and prison programs that are predicated upon the old, antiquated, ancient notion of the gentleman scholar, you are excluding the needs of the students of color that are primarily being served in these correctional institutions. You're excluding women. We rarely talk about women in these conversations about incarceration because they, from a numeric perspective, make up such a small percent of the population, but we tend to keep forgetting that they comprise the largest rising incarceration rate in the country at this time. And so when you start to carve out these different sections of the population because you want to teach everyone Shakespeare, because you think that Shakespeare is the sole person, or Faulkner or Chaucer or Bronte, when you think that they are the only ones who can talk about the human experience at the exclusion of Baldwin, Morrison, Ellison, et cetera, Kiese Layman, when you are excluding all of these authors, you are telling students that their experiences, their histories, their stories, their memoirs, the events in their lives are not worth talking about. They're not worth canonizing. They're not worth having critical discussions around. And that can devalue the student both inside and on the free world campus. And so this larger idea of the gentleman scholar is pervasive and destructive in free world campuses, and even more so inside correctional facilities where there are already oppressive structures, already power hierarchies, power disparities, et cetera. When you add that gentleman scholar, white supremacist ideological structure to the already oppressive white supremacist ideological structure, you do not have a functional higher ed program. You simply have someone perpetuating, a program perpetuating the same racism that they probably made a statement about 6 months ago.
Boom. Okay, then. Michelle, you want to follow up? You're not mute. I mean, you're muted.
I don't know if we're allowed to comment.
Go ahead. Comment.
But I appreciate everything you said, Aaron. And so what I appreciate in that is that it reminds me of how we set up the Indiana Women's Prison History Project. We set it up so that we were epistemically privileging our experience, our lens as being captive women, in order to, as a methodology in which to examine the archive about the prison that we were incarcerated in, the first 15-year history of the facility. And we're currently got a manuscript on that with the new press, and we're very excited about it. But it speaks to this idea about flipping the script about what is the way in which we look at our history, what is knowledge production, what is valid knowledge, what is valuable, what is a subjugated knowledge, and starting to value our experiences as being worthy enough as a lens in which to examine our own condition, but also a way in which to look at history. And so that's one of the things that we've done with the project that we're working on. And I think that it causes us to, the word I want to see is re-examine why we privilege the knowledge base of ghetto white men, is what my faculty said at NYU. It's like, can we put the ghetto white man off to the side for a second and privilege our experiences and our life histories as a lens in which to look at an archive, as the way in which to examine our current condition. Yeah.
George, did you want to respond at all?
Was that for George or me? I wanted to.
George, if he wanted to respond.
Oh, sorry.
No, but
I feel like I'm just watching it.
I didn't know if you wanted to,
because I wanted to chime back in too.
okay, well, go ahead.
Okay, so I get hype about this. I don't know if y'all can tell.
Go ahead, go off.
So, with the Jami Sisterhood, one of our first webinars was back in May, and we talked about decolonizing the curriculum. And it is a very deliberate process that has to happen. You've got to do an audit, a self-assessment of the courses that you're teaching, and question every text, question why you are teaching it. If the answer for why you're teaching, Romeo and Juliet is because that's what you're supposed to teach, then that's not a good enough answer. And so just to provide a little bit of an example, with Second Chance, I teach an English Lit and composition course that all of our first years take. And initially, when I looked at my syllabus, I had about half of the dead white man canon, and then I had like my favorite authors, right? So I'm doing the canon because I feel like I'm supposed to, and then I'm doing other books because I like them. And what I realized is that is totally inefficient. That is not the way that a curriculum should be structured. And so I just went through and started taking out texts and moving things around, because you also have to pay attention to the order in which texts are presented as you're kind of building the theme and answering important questions. But what ultimately ended up happening, because I made a deliberate, conscious attempt to provide a diversity of experiences, I now have an English Lit and Foundation syllabus that has no white authors on it at all. Not because Chaucer didn't contribute to some great literature, but because I think Alice Wong's Disability Visibility is a better text to talk about sections of the population that we don't talk about. Because we also don't talk about disabled people who are in prison. We don't talk about disabled people more broadly. Disabled people are authors. They are contributing to this, this broader academic zeitgeist. And Joyce just wasn't doing that. And so from Alice Wong to Kiese Layman to obviously Morrison, because I still like Toni Morrison, there are these critical texts that are becoming part of the Second Chance canon. Same with the sociology course that we're teaching. All of the authors are people of color. So we're reading When They Call You a Terrorist. We're reading Brother, I'm Dying. We're reading An Untamed Heart. So we have LGBTQ representation. We've got Black women. We've got Black men. We have Asian and Asian American writers. It is wholly possible to have a rigorous and academically rigorous and diverse curriculum at the same time. The two can happen, and they should.
Okay. George, did you want to jump in at all?
It's interesting. I feel like I'm back in one of my classrooms at YDS when we were studying liberation theology. I've heard it once said that you can go through a whole theology program and get a PhD in theology in this country and never come across a Black author. And so why is it that we can't read the father of Calvinism and Reformed theology, John Calvin, and the father of Black liberation theology, James Cone, at the same time and in the same space? And it's not just the fact that people don't want to teach what they don't believe, because I've talked to many people, including professors who teach a number of different thinkers and theorists and theologians, reform critics, etc., that don't actually believe their theological positions or where they land. And so that's just not it, right? It's just that we have these particular types of canons that we think have to continue to be reproduced, and that they're somehow immutable, and that adding other types of voices is somehow going to diminish. Anyway, I'll just stop there. But I know in my classes that I taught, I had the privilege of going back into prison and teaching. And when I taught contemporary Christian theologies, I called it theologies with a plural instead of theology, because there is no one theology, there's theologies. And I wanted to give a broad spectrum of different thinkers, even thinkers I completely disagree with. And so that way people would have a diverse understanding of the field, and also engage different thinkers that are representative of the people that I'm teaching with or that I'm studying with. Inside the college.
And I think just to piggyback on all of you, it goes back for me anyway to who are the instructors who are going inside of our prisons to teach. And if all of our instructors are overwhelmingly white, then that adds a whole other layer to it, because how much attention are they paying to scholars who don't look like them? And so I think a lot of that has to do with who the instructors are as well, and what kinds of prejudices are they bringing inside when they go in to teach. But I won't get off on my spiel on that. I will move along to our next question. And I'll kick it back to Michelle. So what's in your ideal world, what would college and prison look like?
Well, obviously, as an abolitionist, the goal for me is to ultimately not need college and prison. But the reality is that if I'm going to advocate for any carceral bureaucratic institutions to exist inside of prison, it's going to be higher education prison programming and an external oversight mechanism of that institution or Department of Correction. Those are two things, the only two things I think that should be added that doesn't exist if it doesn't exist already in an institution anywhere. But in that, a higher education program that is in a prison should be oriented toward decarceration. They should be oriented towards getting themselves out of a job. In order to do that, it must be student-centered. It must be from the very beginning thinking about the outcomes that the student must experience in order to be successful. In other words, bringing a program in so without having spoken to any of the students in that institution about where they are and what their needs are is an ineffective institution to me. Is a lax and lazy institution to me, because there needs to be a complete plug-in from the moment that student is administered, that is admitted to that person completing that credential. If they're on the outside, there needs to be a real understanding with the Department of Correction that they are not there to extend the Department of Correction through their programming, that they're not there to be a tentacle of the carceral state. They're not there to participate in social control, that they're there to offer education, which is a pathway to transformation, as a pathway to liberation, a pathway to freedom. And so it must be oriented that way. So the conversations that you have with the Department of Correction when you go in and say, I'm going to bring a college program in, need to be student-centered from the very beginning. No student should go to a higher education program in school and not complete it and get out and not know what to do.
Right.
And not have anyone that they could contact to say, hey, I'm out now. What's my next step? That should be already built in. Do you know how many people fall through the cracks because the university that was willing to take money from the government or state in order to provide them an education, and then they get out, they can't communicate with them because they're still going into the facility and they don't want to get gate locked. So they're like, throw my hands up. You try, you call this number, you run over here, you go over there, you run around and do all of these things, when a good higher education program would have said, look, I'm keeping these 2 or 3 staff members from never entering the institution so that they can always be the person that you contact when you get out. There's ways in which to work your program so that it is oriented towards the successful outcomes for the student. And you can say that you're doing that, but if you have not sat down and spoken to your students about what do you do when you get out, and you have not made an effort as a university to connect yourself with community-based organizations to assist that student, then you, to me, I'm gonna find the right word. You are failing them. You are failing them. Yeah. Every university program can't be the re-entry program, but you should make a good concerted effort to have that connection, those partnerships in which that student can talk to. For example, for me, when I got out, I was and I went to New York. My university has the prison university program, prison education program, Pell. And so there were formerly incarcerated people there who was able to actually walk me around the grounds and show me what I needed to do. But did they have a huge reentry program that helps with this other emotional housing, stuff like that? No, they didn't at the time. But luckily, they just had people who did it, who were not connected with the carceral state, not connected with the Department of Correction, not connected with probation and parole. They just could help me, right? And that's critical. That's critical.
Okay. Did Dr. Corbett or George want to jump in on that?
You know, Michelle be stealing my thunder, so.
Well, Dr. Corbett, the next question is actually for you. So, higher ed is not equipped to help with reentry. What options do we need to fix this?
So I'm gonna be like, ditto Michelle, or she's on this side of me. So I'm going to amplify what Michelle said. Higher education institutions are simply not equipped to do reentry. Truth be told, some of y'all don't even do student affairs properly. Some of y'all don't even do residence life properly. Some of y'all don't even do instruction and curriculum design properly. And so to think that higher ed institutions, and this is even pre-COVID, to think that higher ed institutions that have all of these flaws and challenges in the things that they are actually supposed to be doing are capable of then structuring a complex, comprehensive reentry program is just silly. They're not equipped to do that, and they don't care to do that. They don't have the resources to do that. And so I want to underscore what Michelle was saying. Higher ed institutions, and especially the elite ones that think that they can do whatever they want, however they want, because they have all of the resources, they need to humble themselves and start partnering with community-based institutions, as Michelle was saying, in order to help provide those students who are released with the resources that they need, or at the very least, contacts to other people who have access to the resources that they need. So for example, I don't work in housing. However, I have someone who I grew up with who works in a housing program. And so I can direct my alums to that person so that they can handle some of their housing needs. For some of our alums, we're able to provide, short internships so that they can get some money to get on their feet. We had one alum that needed a watch and a belt, but didn't have a job because felony record. And so we were able to help him out in that way. We were only able to do that because our orientation, as Michelle was saying, is a student orientation. It is a student-facing orientation. It is a student service orientation. We do college, we do the pathway to the credential, but we also understand that the after is equally as important, so that, as George was saying, when you have that lifetime of trying to adjust from prison to real world, you have people who are helping you out along the way. And so, just kind of in summary, and this is for all higher ed and prison programs, but again, especially for, the Ivies, the elites, the Seven Sisters, whatever we want to call them, y'all need to remember that you are part of communities. As higher ed institutions, even for the gentlemen scholars, you were built inside of communities in order to train the gentlemen scholars of those communities. You need to remember that you are part of the community, and when you are teaching inside prisons, your community has now extended. And so instead of buying up all the land in the places where your students are going to be released to so that they have nowhere to live when they get out, you need to be thinking about how you can partner with folks in the neighborhood so that people have these housing options.
Okay. George, you want to add anything, or did they cover it?
I was going to mention something before, but now I got to revise what I have to say, because I am in complete agreement. So part of what I wanted to mention before, and maybe I'll rephrase it differently, was and to go to that point, is that higher education institutions can't do everything. And there's already, as was mentioned, there's already challenges and problems with what they're trying to do. And so then taking up extra resources to do something, well, I don't want to say half-assed, but anyway, to not do something well when those resources could be better put to use by partnering. I think that's the better approach. But also that there are some things that maybe some colleges do well, but sometimes those are the things that are not being done inside of the prison. And so many times college and prison programs will do one thing: they'll offer college courses. But yet when you go on campus, they have a wide range of student centers. They have a wide range of services available to students. They have large alumni networks. And so sometimes people feel that they're not really part of the college when they get out, but they're part of the initiative or the program, right? And so are there ways to make student life inside of the prison more, and now analogous or have access opportunities on the outside. One thing that happens, and it's just because, I went to BARD, is that once they had the BARD debate union and they were able to be places like Harvard and other schools, they brought other aspects of what they feel they may be doing well and brought it into the prison. That not only transformed, I think, just the people on the inside, but it's also transforming the narrative on the outside of what is possible and who people in prison are. Mm-hmm. And so I think colleges should think, number one, what can we do well and what do we do well, and be real honest about that. And it's okay if you come to the point where, hey, listen, we do A and B well, we don't do C and D well, and that's okay. And amplify those, right? Like focus your resources on those and do those well, and expand it to people for not just for people on the inside as well, and then partner in ways that help support the good work being done inside of our communities, where that's what all the people do. Because I've noticed when I first got out and I went back to Albany, there were about 5 or 6 Albany, New York, 5 or 6 programs. But it wasn't what those programs were designed to do. They were designed to do something else, and then they just added reentry work, and they did it terribly. And so when funding got short, what do you think got cut? All those programs. So it's better to have maybe 1 or 2 organizations that are doing things really, really well than have a bunch of institutions that are not doing it as well.
Okay.
Right. And I just want to add one thing to that, George. Because you made a really good point about how do you orient yourself towards your student, the incarcerated student, in such a way that person feels like they can grow and develop. I'm thinking that when you're dealing with a major university or even some small universities, there is this there's this temptation that, oh, you've got this body of people in here, you can do some research on them, you can do some studying, we can start giving these guys surveys and asking them questions. I want to suggest that any good work that you plan or decide to do about the population in which you're providing programming is that you do that in collaboration with your students. As opposed to objectifying them and thingifying them and studying them. And you need to co-author, co-publish. You need to help that student build their CV, build their professional standing in academia, and provide pathways to that. There are conferences that allow incarcerated people to present at. There are publications. There are, and journals that people can submit their writing and their research to. There's a way in which to orient that relationship between faculty and student, or university and student, that is all about the spiraling and ongoing development of the student, that is not exploitative. And I think I just need to say that, because I think there's a temptation there with a captive population that is that people can see ways in which they could study that population because they're providing a program there.
Yes. Great. Did you want to say something, Dr. Corbett? One second. I just want to remind everyone watching to please drop your comments in our comment section or using the hashtag equity is justice. So Dr. Corbett, what were you going to say?
So just kind of 2 quick points that kind of put into like practicality and real life examples, what George and Michelle are talking about here in Connecticut with Second Chance. One of the things that we are doing with our partnership with Southern New Hampshire is just taking an evaluative framework for our entire initiative that is being co-designed by the students in the program. I was very clear in the partnership MOU that there is no research to be done on students. It is only with students. And so what that means is I now have to equip them with, how to do participatory action research. How do you code and qualitative research? Are there students that want to start to learn the statistics to do quantitative research? How do I get that material into them? How do I get researchers into them? And all of these different questions. And how do I get DOC approval? I think a lot of times program administrators shy away from having a lot of these sometimes difficult conversations with DOCs because they're like, it's too hard. Yeah, it is hard. But if you are about liberation work, then you do the hard work that's necessary to make sure that your students are having the best example. A lot of my students, when I would give them, journal articles, peer-reviewed articles for their assignments, especially those that talked about people who are incarcerated and formerly incarcerated, they were just kind of disgusted at the narratives that were being put out there. And I said, the way to solve that is to start writing the narrative. And so let's start thinking about what are some research ideas that y'all have that can kind of get out into the field, into the discipline, so that the narrative, y'all are leading the change of this narrative. I'm just here to spend my money and get y'all some books to help it happen. But it's real work. And again, it goes back to, George talking about liberation theologies, Michelle talking about going into this work with a liberatory spirit. If you are not going to do the work to help your students liberate themselves and the way that they feel they want to be liberated, then this is not the field for you. Mm-hmm. You're doing it to get tenure, to build a profile for yourself. This is not the field for you because this is hard work. This is isolating work at times. This is lonely work at times. Like, I can't tell you how many times I have to call Dr. Willingham or Michelle. I might start calling George. Friends that I know in this space when I have a particularly difficult class, or a student has decided that they're going to disclose some information and I need to figure out how to process that. And so we just need to keep all of that in mind as we are moving forward. This is a people business. Somebody just walked in my driveway. This is a people, student-oriented business. It's work, it's job, it's a calling, and we have to keep that in mind.
Yes. Thank you for that. George, did you want to add anything else for me?
There's really not too much to add because it's been said and much better than I would say. But I will add one point. I think many times, or we shouldn't be constrained, or when we're thinking about or envisioning this work, the starting point is not what is corrections going to allow us to do. We shouldn't start with the limitation,
right?
But we should envision on what we want to accomplish and then seek to make that manifest. And I think that there's a lot of programs that are pushing the boundaries of what's possible. And if we don't do that hard work, and sometimes there's a level of fear that if you push too far, that you'll be removed. But I don't think that this work is for the fearful.
Right.
It's for the fearless. And so we should be thinking through and envisioning this work, not from a place of limitation, but of what's possible, and then push the boundary and then push the boundaries there.
Yes. Thank you for that. Michelle, were you want to say something?
No,
Okay.
I totally agree with
Okay. All right. So, on this note of being fearless and, and not having any limitations, but some limitations that are put on people who are, taking classes inside or going inside to teach. I want Dr. Corbett to talk a little bit about the Jami Sisterhood and why she and I and our colleague, Dr. Bahia Muhammad, started the Jami Sisterhood.
Yeah, so incarceration, the carceral state, carceral supervision, it goes by a lot of different names, while the objects, right, of this system are often people of color. The optics of who is leading and doing the volunteering are all very white, and in particular, very white woman or white femme identified. And so what we have to start doing is understanding how the prevalence of white folks in this space can serve to undermine the work that Black folks have been doing in this space for the longest of times. Prison education, higher ed in prison, is not a new phenomenon. The research tells us that we've got easily a century and a half of these kinds of programmings and these kinds of programs in one form or another. And so when we start to look again historically, and Bria has done a lot of this work, we start to see how Black women, Black men have been going into facilities for a long time, but the funding, the fame, the recognition, the funding, again, is going to the institutions, the nonprofits that are white-led and often white woman-led. And so when you have kind of the perpetuation of these programs that are also perpetuating gentleman scholar kinds of expectations, you start to have, you know, this intersection of, or this juxtaposition of whiteness as leadership, Blackness and color as, you know, kind of subservient, receiving all of these other things. And in that space, there is no room, there's very little room for the Black women who are doing the research, who are the practitioners, who have family members who are incarcerated, and go and process all of that as they are walking into facilities to teach, to run programs, whether they're doing it with a higher ed institution or whether they're teaching the ABE courses, right? We have to think about how Black women are treated inside the DOC as DOC employees, because we understand that how that paradigm is working ends up getting transposed onto the Black women who are coming in from the outside, from higher ed institutions and community-based organizations. What we were seeing, and that's myself, Dr. Willingham, and Dr. Muhammad at Howard University, was that there was just nowhere for us to talk about the very specific issues that we encounter, that we process in doing this work. And we also had grown very tired and very weary of begging for a seat at the table, right? The proverbial seat at the proverbial table. And so we said, you know what? We're going to build our own house on our own street. We are going to have our own tables that we are going to build, and we are going to build and or buy our own seats at the tables that we are building. And what we've noticed is that as soon as we did that, as soon as we started to be very vocal about being anti-racist, about being diverse and inclusive in curriculum and instructional methodologies and all of these different pieces, understanding, just being in that space is resistance. As we started to gain momentum, other organizations and programs started to adopt similar language. And so there was, a faculty training group with a group of absolutely brilliant scholars that were talking about educator language things, universal design, instructional methodologies. We were talking about harm reduction. We were talking about using harm reduction tenets as the centrality of higher ed in prison. All of a sudden, we started seeing people talk about harm reduction, and we started seeing people talk about curriculum design and decolonizing the curriculum. We also saw, the more we became vocal about the importance of community-based organizations and understanding the contextualization of higher ed institutions and the relationship to the community, all of a sudden, more people are talking about the importance of community-based organizations. And now in some institutions are like, hey, are there community-based organizations around that want to help what I'm doing? So what we're seeing are two things. One, we found that there was an absolute need for this space for Black women to just feel affirmed, to share energy, to share space, to be uplifted and supported, and to network across the country. But we also see what we also called early on in our JAMI webinars, that we were going to be copied. People were going to try to replicate. They were going to try to take pieces of the flavor and use them themselves. But what they don't understand is that when we talk about, like, my grandmother was a wonderful cook. She needed all the spices to make her meals the best that they could be. She couldn't just pick and choose, just like schools and programs can't pick and choose which part of the community-based model do you want to take? Which piece of the anti-racism thing do you want to take? Which piece of, restorative justice do you want to take? You've got to take all of it in order for it to be effective and functional and meaningful. So that's why we started the JAMI Sisterhood.
Yes. All right. Thank you. Thank you for that very much. I want to, so we have time for 2 more questions. So, um, hmm, I want to go to George. Let's kick it back to George. And I think that you just started to talk about this a little bit in the beginning, um, about your experiences of being in a prison classroom. Could you elaborate though a little bit more on what that transition was like coming from a classroom inside to a classroom on a more traditional college campus?
Yeah, and I see we're looking at time too, so hopefully I can be a little briefer. And if I'm not, just cut me off. But I think to start there is to kind of set in brief the context of what it's like when you enter a prison system. And when you get to downstate in New York, they basically shackle you almost down to your, you feel almost naked. Shackled around your waist, around your arms, down to your feet, shackled next to somebody else. They shave off all your hair, they erase your name, and they give you this number. And so I wasn't known as George Chochos, son, husband, father. I was known as 0180532, kind of like a branded cattle or like a serial number on a product. And so that number became my identity in some sense, in terms of the relation to the way the state saw me. And when I got to Sing Sing, I remember stretching out both of my arms and I could touch both sides of the cell, and there were 70 people. Well, there's 70 cells on each tier, 5 tiers high, all crammed. I actually went back to Sing Sing at the beginning of this year before COVID hit. And when they actually gave us a tour, I had walked in there in 2001 in shackles, and here I was walking back in with a suit on, going to have conversations with people on the inside to talk about a particular type of program that someone I was working with was going to start, called the Frederick Douglass program. There's a plug for Mark Howard at Georgetown. And when we took the tour, I was shocked when I got to the cell block that I was in, and I was shocked at how small those cells were. I mean, they were shockingly small. I don't know how 2 people fit in them. I don't know how me and somebody else, 2 football lockers, a bunk bed, and a toilet. How we somehow psychologically could see ourselves inhabiting that space at the same time and making sense of living like that. And it made me want to cry. Because I noticed that nobody would look me in the eyes, because they were probably thinking, why are you looking at us? We're not on display like animals, right? And so when I got to Eastern and I found out Bard College was there, and when I got accepted, it was in the college classroom, and I've said this in other venues, where I felt like I was starting to develop the will to dream in a nightmare. Mm. The bars were still on the windows in the college classroom in the jail. You could still sense that you were in a prison, but something happened when you walked in there. I wasn't 0180532 anymore. I was a Bard College student who was there about to have an intellectual engagement with a professor who didn't see me as an inmate, who didn't see me as the culmination of my failures, but as a student whose mind had worth and value in this space. And that started to shape not just how I saw me, how I saw other people. You would start to you would see it seemed like prison became, the physical space didn't change, but how I viewed it, how I viewed myself, and how I viewed others changed. And so that was part of, outside of my own personal experience as a Christian, that experience radically transformed my life. Engaging in philosophical texts and the wide range and the breadth of disciplines, it made me see the world in a different way. It made me want to engage it in a particular type of way that was completely different than how I knew to be in the world before. And so the college classroom is transformative in a number of different ways, but also being a student was almost like it seemed like it was a psychological defense mechanism against the continued process of inmateization, AKA dehumanization, that happens over a period of time. I don't know why we expect to put human beings into a space and a system meant to break you and expect you to come out whole.
Mm.
I don't understand that. And so college and prison has a wide range of impacts and effects. And in one of my final classes at Yale, I wrote on this many times, and I'll kind of end with these last points, is many times we think of, or we talk about prison and criminal justice reform, and this goes back to a question I was asked earlier. We think of it as results-based, right? We think of, well, this is what it's going to do in some undefined future, right? Like the future benefit view of college and prison, that at some point people aren't going to come back to prison, as if somehow that should be the only reason why we have college and prison is because it's going to somehow benefit your neighbor when you get out, or some future effect, right? Some effect-based reason why we should have these programs. And then there's the kind of education as a good in and of itself, right? And then there's the transformation of the individual and the institution, and then, by analogy, the rest of society, right? That you have these different transformational effects that keep growing and in any way spread throughout the society. But then there's the point that I wanted to make, is that all of that can be true. But I would say that college and prison is the only humanizing element in a dehumanizing institution. It's a place where you reconnect with your humanity in a way that you're not going to get in anything else inside of the prison, because every other program inside of the prison has the prison's interests, has the state's interests at heart, not the transformation or the liberation of the individual, and not even society's best interests. Outside of prison, we have alarming, I'll just bring recidivism rates, even though we know statistics are just numerical representations of reality, they really don't tell the whole story. Khalid Muhammad talks about this, statistics only tell one side of the story, they don't tell the whole truth, right? And if we think of no other area or sector of society would we allow that level of failure and not call it a systemic problem. I went to Yale. There's no way if 80% of the people were failing out of Yale, hell yes, they would say, what are those college students doing? But they would also question the system, the teachers. They would want answers for every aspect of that particular system. And they would want to know, why is this happening? When it comes to prisons and it comes to jails, somehow it's all individual responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so when you have that level of failure, for that level of a price tags, I need to talk to my people on the right too, because they seem to see things only in economic terms right now. What's best for the economy? Oh, man, I'm gonna get myself in trouble for that one. But see, nowhere else would we allow that level of failure. Enter the college and prison dynamic is the only humanizing element in the humanizing institution that allows people to flourish and I think achieve the benefits a society wants out of its particular systems. Now, right now, as we know it, and here goes to the abolition part of it, I'm finding myself moving further and further in that particular range, is that notice that we need things outside of the system to come in order to somehow make the system work. Which then tells you that mere just doing time inside of a prison, and there's actually people that talk about this, like the political value of time and things of that nature, that why do we think that somehow durational time is the way to assuage all of society's problems? How does time plus a prison cell somehow address all of quote unquote society's problems? How have we gotten to a place to where we think that particular type of space is supposed to be a panacea for our nation's challenges and problems? And so back to, I know I kind of got on my high horse here for a second. However, the college classroom, just again, is a microcosm of society, allows for the humanization of the person inside. It also transforms the meaning of the institution. The people that come in to teach as well, they're transformed. And it actually creates the type of societal benefits that people want. Mm-hmm. But we shouldn't even think of it in terms of societal benefits. What are we doing? How are we helping people live whole lives? and prison should not be the negation of the capacity for human flourishing, but should be a pathway to it.
Yes.
And I think if we think of that, then we are all better off. And we would have maybe a more just system that we need to replace the system that we have with a system that allows for the capacity of human flourishing, not the devaluing of human life and the negation of for human flourishing.
Yes. All right. Thank you. Thank you. So I want to make sure that we have time for our viewer questions and comments. But does Michelle or Dr. Corbett have any final thoughts that they want to share? Or did George kind of just handle that?
Yeah, he did. He did it. And I just would like to say that a college program that is doing that work that George is talking about must be encouraged and have the courage to walk that tightrope between providing that to the student and the relationship with the Department of Correction and the larger society who looks at incarcerated people as animals. And it has to have the balls to walk in that space of handling the tension. I know that some people feel like higher education programs in prison are taking away money that should better be used by people who've never been incarcerated, or officers feel sometimes that incarcerated people are getting a higher education, and what sense does that make, because my child can't get access to that higher education in prison. And so a college program has to be able to respond effectively to those who would want to dismantle it, right? And so you got to have thick skin. You have to be able to walk on that tightrope. And I think that programs that are successful are student-centered, but also advocate and act from that space that education is a right. And for people who have already been traumatized, marginalized, and oppressed by the situations that have brought them to incarceration, particularly for women, this is a remediation. This is a help meet to heal the past. And that orientation needs to be more out there. Should be put forward in every situation to tell the naysayers to sit down and be quiet.
Okay.
I do have one point. I want to, and this may border on sort of like unpopular opinion, but I would love for us to start problematizing this dichotomous relationship that we often posit between higher ed institutions and prisons. And what made me think of it is George's comment about the total institution, right? So when we talk about total institutions, prisons and universities are considered total institutions. And when we think about higher ed, particularly the perpetuation of the gentleman scholar, I really hope Dr. D.L. Stewart is listening, because I just be talking about his article all the time. When we talk about the perpetuation of the gentleman scholar ideal, that means that there is an ideal to which higher ed institutions expect students to conform. Certainly differently than the way prisons expect people who are incarcerated to conform, but there is still an expectation of conformity that higher ed institutions have that they do not acknowledge, right? They like to consider themselves on the opposite end of the continuum. We are about freedom and everything all the time, and we're so different from prison. In a lot of ways, you're not. In a lot of ways, you are perpetuating the same power disparities, the same hierarchies, the same cultural, personal, spiritual deaths that prisons are perpetuating. And so I want us to be more nuanced and more critical about the balance of that relationship, and understand that it is more of a fluid continuum than a lot of folks might indicate. It doesn't mean that they're not beneficial, but it does mean we need to recognize the similarities so that we're not replicating harm.
Yes. All right. Thank you. So we have our first question, and our first question is from Vivian Nixon. She says, educational justice and equity is about opportunity and about power. How does access and inclusion for people in prison and post-prison and other system impacted people relate to political power and the vote? Do you need me to repeat? Or somebody got it? Okay.
No, I think it relates like this. There are lawmakers that are creating public policy that directly impacts the incarcerated and formerly incarcerated person's life. So when we're talking about the REAL Act and other legislation around higher education, prison, and second chance, Pell is one of them. We need to be using our vote to elect those people who will support legislation that will bring higher education to those incarcerated. People who are in an opposition to that, or people who believe that LWOP should be an excluded population in that, those people are the type of people who should not be our elected officials. And so all the way to the incarcerated person sitting on a bunk, okay, your vote matters in electing people who will keep that incarcerated person with access to higher education. It's a direct link.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Anybody else want to answer that? Got it. Okay. So our next question comes from Brenda Lysing, and apologies if I mispronounce your last name. She says, totally makes sense that we consider the content of courses we offer. So can you speak to any pedagogical techniques or styles that work better?
Hey, yes. So I feel like I just get so amped about this. There are 3 books that I keep by my desktop in my office. The first is Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. The second is The Pedagogy of Liberation, which is co-authored by Freire and Ira Shore, and is structured as a series of dialogues that they have about teaching a lot of the farming children in the communities where they were located. The third book is Teaching to Transgress by Bell Hooks. All of these just have phenomenal, comprehensive strategies that you can use inside your classroom. And I majored in education as an undergrad, and so I'm an educator by training. And one of the techniques that I use is to be just very open with students about what my expectations are and how they are formed. So in every syllabus that I make, I talk about Freire, I talk about dialogic engagement, I talk about how I am going to strive to not privilege my voice, my language, my vocabulary over that of students, because I see them as co-creators of their own knowledge, co-creators of their understanding, producers of knowledge. I think understanding that dynamic shift is really, really important. And it can be a challenge sometimes. I remember in the very, very first class that I had in the maximum security facility where our credential program is, I would ask for, feedback on a particular book or lecture or the semester. And the students were hesitant to be critical because what they voiced to me was that they didn't want me to feel, badly. They didn't want me to, say, oh, well, this isn't working, I'm not going to come back to the facility. They didn't want the program to leave. I said, well, I'm not going anywhere. I bought a house and I'm going to be here till I die. So I'm not going anywhere. This program is going to stay. But for it to be the best possible program, I need you to have input. I need you to feel comfortable to critique me, critique my syllabi, critique my teaching strategy, critique the pathway that we're putting together, because again, they are co-creators of the knowledge. They are colleagues, they are peers in this program.
Okay. George and Michelle, do you want to speak to techniques that work especially for you as students or not?
I think I will only add that, and I mentioned it earlier, thinking of the incarcerated student and I'm going to flip that, as a student who happens to be incarcerated, so that the orientation is toward the student first, as opposed to their captive demographic location, which means then you would be thinking about opportunities to expose that student to more pathways, to, as I said before, to write, to publish, to engage in the larger community, because you're looking at that student you look at the person as a student who just so happens to be incarcerated. Yeah.
Okay. All right. M. Daniels, she would like for you to speak more specifically to uplifting women in these spaces, primarily because the impact of incarcerating women has very high impacts on children, as close to 85% of incarcerated women are the primary caregivers and their families. So could you speak more to about how education uplifts women?
Yeah, and I can speak to it with a direct example. So I worked for Oakland City University as a clerk registrar, and they brought programming into the facility. And so I was there the day that the state added a budget reduction for the college program in the bottom of another bill, and our college program disappeared overnight. And I was there when I saw all of our students, 70 plus students, devastated because they weren't going to not only get their time cuts, but they weren't going to get home in the time frame they thought they would get home to their families and children. I have sat with women and cried with women who were devastated that they knew they had let their children down by whatever brought them to incarceration. And as Black women, we have often carried the burdens of ourselves, our children, those people, those other folks in which we served in domestic labor, and on and on and on and on in the schoolhouses. And so the weight of that was tremendous for them. And I had, as in my position of registrar, I sat with those women, and the value of earning that credential was to that individual greater than them achieving a certificate for themselves. It was representative of something that their children could see about them that was different and positive, and their families and their communities and outward. And so in my experience, that was one of the most hardest days of my life in incarceration, is to watch that happen. And so when we had an opportunity to bring college back, I worked like a dog. I worked like a dog to do whatever I needed to do so that we could have that programming for incarcerated women, because it's transformative for them beyond and for themselves and beyond themselves.
Yeah.
And Black women especially, because we are fighting from all sides.
Yes.
And we're impacted from on all sides. And the work is never ending in that regard.
Yes. Yes. You're absolutely right. Absolutely right. Did Dr. Corbett or George want to add anything before we wrap up?
I'll just make two quick points, because I kind of probably went over time on my last answer, but I want to wrap up kind of a couple of the questions that were answered. Number one, just to contextualize the question that Dr. Nixon mentioned, if we were to think of the prison population, 2.3 million, I think it is, it's larger than the state populations of Wyoming, Vermont, and Alaska combined. That is huge. It would be the fourth largest city. And so if we were to think of that level of constituency, so of course, those that have the tough on crime rhetoric and policies are going to want to make sure that power cannot materialize into a vote, because it would it would negate their political power, right? It would have a negative effect on their political power. So that's just one way to think of it. Number two, in terms of for the potential of the women, the question on women, I was trained by a Black womanist theologian. I just want to preface that. And so when I see both my wife and I went to prison. I went to prison and it radically transformed my life. I acquired education. And so for me, part of my prison experience is a positive, because it kind of set up the life I have today, only because of the education I received. For her, it's destroyed her life in the last 20 years. It continues to be something that's negative, because she didn't have access to the same opportunities that I had. And so sometimes we think because we know that, 94 or 92 or 93% of the people in prison are men, that somehow because we shouldn't let the numbers make it a zero-sum game, to where we have to make a choice between, do we create programs for men or for women? I think we need to get to a space, and that's why I'm working so hard to get Pell back in, so that way everybody in prison can have access. And that's what we're talking about today. Universal eligibility. It shouldn't be a zero-sum game to where if we put a program here, it means it's at the expense of these people over here, because we need to allow and actualize, as we've seen on this show. We have 3 brilliant systems. And I think of all the men and the women who are sitting inside of prison, who have such great drive and determination and brilliance that needs to be untapped and unlocked. And I wonder, who would we be as a society if we allowed all of our brothers and sisters inside of prison to have access to the same life-changing opportunity that we want for ourselves and that we want for our loved ones? Who would we be as a society if we actualized the brilliance and potential of our women languishing inside of these human warehouses of despair?
Great. And that is a perfect way to end. I would like to thank all of our panelists, George, Michelle, Aaron, even Renell, who at the last minute couldn't join us because he is literally taking care of his business. And Aaron, what's the name of the business real quick? Because he's one of your alums.
Yeah, so Renell is a Second Chance alum. The name of his business is Juice Kings, and it is located in Stamford, Connecticut.
Thank you. All right. And also, do not forget to take action by using the link on your screen. So again, thank you all so much and have a great day.